Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to Philosophy of Food. And this week, this module, we are going to discuss food justice. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on Peter Singer's very influential and hotly debated paper titled "Famine, Affluence, and Morality." So that's kind of the focus that we'll have for this module. And then in future weeks, we'll turn to some other issues regarding food justice. But one thing that I think we need to make clear is that it's just a fact that there is a lot of suffering that occurs. A lot of terrible things are happening in the world that could be avoided if we were able to do more to provide food and resources to people living in poverty all over the world. Certainly, this is a major issue. It's a global ethical issue. But even in our own backyards, even here in Lincoln or in other places in the United States, just more could be done. We have far more money than what we really need to provide food and security for people. If we wanted to end poverty, we could end poverty. In fact, there's another paper called Singer's Solution to Poverty that's sometimes included in anthologies for different ethics courses. In this class, we're going to focus on famine, affluence, and morality, and we're going to consider in some detail here what exactly the argument is that Singer offers and some potential objections that have been suggested in the literature. All right, so the first thing I want to do is I want to consider what we actually mean by this term ought. Right. Singer is arguing that we have a kind of moral obligation to donate some of our money, our income to help starving children or help other people living in famine as a result of poverty or wars or different climate disasters. So this term ought is really important. It's telling us that we are doing something morally wrong if we fail to do what we ought to do. Right? We have a kind of moral obligation, a moral duty, or a moral responsibility, you might say. So this is a normative concept. It's telling us what our actions should be. Clearly, that's not how we actually behave. It's not a descriptive sort of way of thinking about how human beings actually go about living their lives. Rather, it's a normative claim. It's a normative idea telling us what we should do, even if we fail to do that. So that's what we mean here by ought, right? It's a normative idea. When we use this term ought, it should be understood as referring to a kind of moral obligation or moral duty that someone has. Indeed, if they fail to do what they ought to do, then they've done something morally wrong. Now, remember, in the previous video that you should have watched, I covered this topic of ought implies can and can implies ought. So let me just go ahead and review those principles here real quick. Remember that this notion that if you have a moral obligation to do something, that suggests that you have the ability to do that thing. Arguably, it's not really clear that we can hold somebody morally accountable or morally responsible for failing to do something if they simply couldn't do it in the first place, right? So if we're going to say that you have an obligation to do such and such, then we should also say that you have the ability to do it. You can do it. And that seems fairly reasonable. This ought implies can principle, I think a lot of people at least accept the intuitiveness to it. Now, the can implies ought principle is different. This principle says if you can do such and such, then you ought to do such and such. Right? If you have the ability to donate some of your income to help starving children in Africa, then you ought to donate your money to help starving children, right? It says that the mere ability to do that thing means that you have an obligation to do that thing. And Singer's argument really relies upon this second one, right? This principle that says that if you can do something, then you ought to do something, right? We'll see that show up here in the argument in a moment. But generally, that's the main sort of point of Singer's paper, right? Singer's arguing that most of us, at least, and most of us who live in some sort of an affluent situation, have an affluent lifestyle, let's say, well, most of us do have the ability to do this. So then, in that sense, we have some sort of a moral obligation, a moral requirement to donate at least some portion of our income to help famine relief. Right? This is something that is required of us, morally speaking. Okay, now let's turn to the argument. What exactly is Singer's argument for this claim? It's a very radical claim, so we should have some really good argument for it. The first premise of Singer's argument says if we can prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything of significance, then we ought to do so. Right. And that's this basic notion that we just covered of the can implies ought principle. The second premise in the argument says, well, look, suffering and the death caused by famine and malnutrition, these are very bad things. And I think that that's a reasonable claim. Most of us, I would suppose, would agree with this second premise. The third premise says we can, in fact, actually prevent suffering and death from famine and malnutrition simply by donating some insignificant portion of our income, the cost of maybe a daily coffee or a newspaper or a magazine or going to the movies or whatever. Right? That's not a huge, significant portion of our income. We can certainly do that. And by doing so, we would be preventing suffering and potential deaths from people living in famine and now malnutrition and so forth. Right. So then the conclusion seems to follow according to Singer. Right. Therefore, we ought to donate a portion of our income to help with famine relief. Right. Doing so is a moral obligation that we have. Indeed, if we fail to do so, then we've done something morally wrong. In some sense, we're a part of the problem here. So that's the argument. At least that's the way that Placius describes the argument in the chapter for this week, and I think it's definitely consistent with what Singer says in the paper that you've read for this week. But now let's go ahead and turn to some reasons that could be offered in support of this argument. Right? What could be offered to justify the premises? So, the first point that we need to consider is a particular thought experiment, what we're going to call the drowning child case. This is an example that Singer goes through that's supposed to support the second premise. This is a thought experiment that's supposed to support the general intuition behind the can implies ought principle, which essentially amounts to the second premise of the argument. All right, so here's what Singer discusses with regard to this case. Imagine that you are walking to work and you decided to put on some brand new shoes and a brand new outfit. Maybe that outfit was something you decided to buy. It was kind of an expensive suit or dress or whatever, but you decided to wear this outfit because you wanted to impress a boss or maybe impress a client or something like that. Right. So you maybe let's say you spent somewhere on the order of $200 or $300. Probably not even that much. Maybe $100, something like that, right? 100, maybe $200. All right. So you're walking to work, and on your way to work, you see a child who happens to be drowning in a small pond that you are passing by. Now, you could easily jump in and save that small child. And in doing so, you might sacrifice your brand new shoes and your brand new outfit. But that's a small price to pay, right? It's certainly within your ability. You certainly can save the child. And so it seems as though you've got a moral obligation to save the child, right? Even though you might have wasted the money on the brand new shoes or the outfit that you're wearing, surely that's not a good enough justification to just simply let the child die, right? I think most people's intuition would be on Singer's side here, right? They would probably agree with Singer that says it's more important to save the drowning child than it is to save your brand new shoes and your new outfit. Right, so that's the drowning child case. And Singer thinks that it gives us some reason to accept the can implies ought principle. So this thought experiment seems to support the first premise, the can implies ought premise. Now, what about the second premise? Well, it looked like the second premise was just a fact, right? Bad things do happen. People are suffering and dying from famine all over the world. So then notice that you yourself, and myself included, we could certainly help people who are suffering from famine and poverty, right? We could, instead of spending money on coffee or going to a nice restaurant or going to the movies, buying some new shoes or a new outfit, instead of spending our money this way, we could instead send that money through UNICEF or some other organization that could save people's lives. Right? Since we have the ability to do so, then we have the moral obligation to do so, according to Singer. And so it looks then like we do have some kind of obligation to spend our money to donate at least some portion of our income to help children or other people who are dying from famine. So then another way to think about this support for that premise is an argument by analogy, right? In the same way that we have a moral obligation to save the drowning child because we can save the drowning child, even though we might be sacrificing some new shoes or a new outfit. Well, by analogy, we should also think that we have an obligation to save children who are dying of famine or suffering as a result of poverty all over the world, right? It's an argument by analogy, right? If you think that we have the obligation in the first case, you should likewise think that we have an obligation in the second case. And that's because, according to Singer, there is no morally relevant difference between these kisses, right? Of course, there are differences, right? In one case, the child is drowning. In another case, the child is starving, right? Certainly, there's different differences that we should pay attention to. But according to Singer, these differences are not morally relevant, right? So since there are no morally relevant differences, then if you think there's an obligation in the first case, by analogy, you should also think there's a moral obligation to save these children in the second case as well. The case relating to children or whoever might be dying or suffering due to famine and poverty. So it looks like it just follows that most of us do have this kind of obligation to donate at least some of our income, right? Nobody's saying that you have to donate all of your income. Nobody's saying that you have to, become, poverty stricken yourself. Nobody's saying that you have to start wearing hair shirts or something like that. No, what Singer is saying at this point is for those people who have the ability to donate at least some of their income, then they have an obligation to donate some of their income to help these individuals who are suffering from famine and poverty. Indeed, if you fail to do so, right? If you decide to go buy a coffee, which I did, I actually just bought a coffee about an hour ago. Well, if I buy a coffee, but I don't donate that same amount of money to help starving children, then I'm doing something morally wrong because I could have used that $3 that I spent on the coffee. I could have used that money and sent it to help a starving child somewhere in the world. And so if I failed to donate some portion of my income, if you or maybe your parents fail to donate some portion of your income, then we're doing something morally wrong. Notice how radical of a claim this is. But it should be radical, right? The United States is the wealthiest country in the world. The fact that people are dying from starvation, dying in poverty is just kind of hard to imagine. And so that's the point that Singer is getting at here. For those people who are buying coffees, buying new shoes, going to dinner, buying a fancy car, doing all these things with our income, when we could be spending at least some of that to help starving children, well, that's just morally wrong. There's something terribly wrong about this, according to Singer. Now, clearly, not everybody's going to agree. In fact, there are some initial worries that I think is worth paying attention to. So, for instance, somebody might argue that, well, children on the other side of the world are very, very far away from us. And a drowning child right in front of us is a completely different story, right? Maybe it's the fact that they're right there in front of me, and maybe I can just jump into the pond, or maybe the fact that I see them right in front of me. Maybe that's playing some important role for why we think that we have an obligation in the first case, but not in the second case, right? Maybe it's the fact that the children are on the other side of the world. Well, Singer thinks that that's not a morally relevant difference, right? Morality should be impartial. It should not matter where the person is located, who the person is. right? We shouldn't be biased in that regard, right? It doesn't matter if they're black or white or male or female, living in Africa or living somewhere here in the United States, like in our own backyard in Lincoln, Nebraska, right? Where they're located should not make a difference, morally speaking, because morality is impartial. Now, Singer does seem to suggest that it kind of helps explain why some people are more accepting of the obligation in the first case and less so in the second case. But that's just a psychological explanation of what people actually do. It's not a normative claim about what we ought to do or what moral obligations and duties that we have, right? So Singer thinks that this is not a very good objection. Another sort of worry that somebody might introduce is that at least some of the people in poverty are living in poverty and famine as a kind of result of their own choices or their own actions, right? They're sleeping in the bed that they made. Now, Singer doesn't think that this is going to be a good objection either. He ultimately thinks that we should be worried about anybody living in poverty, but we can avoid this particular worry just by modifying the argument so that we're focusing only on small children. The reason why Singer thinks that we can focus on small children is because, they're still suffering, they're still dying in all sorts of different places throughout the world from famine and poverty and issues like that that we could help with by donating our money. But nonetheless, these small children have not made any decisions of their own that led to their current situation, right? So their situation, living in poverty and famine, is not the consequences of any choices that they made as a small child. So that's one way that we can avoid that particular worry. Now, another point to consider is that we don't really know where the money is going. This is an objection that I hear from students all the time. How do we know that that money's not being spent in some way that we don't approve of? Or how do I really actually know that when I donate $5 or $10 or $100, that that money is going to be used the best way, or whether or not it's being used at all? Now, Singer thinks that there's actually lots of different organizations that have a very good track record, different organizations that we could utilize to help donate our money. In fact, these days we can do that through the internet or just right on our phone, right? So we don't really have to do too much at all. We can just push a button. And these are organizations like UNICEF or other organizations that have similar sorts of track records where Singer thinks that they've kind of done the work for us, so we can trust in their track record. Nonetheless, I think that this is a legitimate worry, but I don't think that it's necessarily going to, excuse anybody from having the moral obligation. It just means that maybe we'll have to do some of our own work to make sure that we're utilizing an organization that does the best job possible. So these are some initial worries, but what about some objections? Let's focus on some specific objections that one might raise that have been raised in the literature throughout the years. Clearly, this is a very radical view. Singer admits that this is not the sort of moral view that most people ascribe to, and so clearly there would be some objections that we need to consider. All right, so the first objection I want to take a look at here is the claim that this sort of obligation is simply too demanding. It's asking too much of us. It's sort of psychologically alienating. It's telling us that what we're doing right now is morally wrong. When I buy a coffee, that's morally wrong because I could instead spend that $3 to help a starving child, and that's just very, very demanding. But in response to this objection, you might think that's not really an objection at all. Indeed, this is the way that Plakius puts the point on page 153. She says, "Doesn't it just show that more is morally required of us than we want to admit? Even if we are unable to fully satisfy our moral obligations to help, this doesn't justify doing nothing. If we can't make all the sacrifices required to save the number of hungry people we could actually save, shouldn't we nonetheless make what modest sacrifices we actually can? $10 a week, suppose, to save at least some people. Surely relieving some suffering, even if not morally sufficient, is better than relieving none at all." Now, she goes on to say another point, which I want to come back to when we consider a different objection. Right afterwards, she says, Suppose the man in the example were walking by a pond full of drowning children. So there's lots and lots of children drowning. Well, does the fact that he cannot save all of them give him a reason not to try to save any of them? Surely not. Surely, even though he can't save every single one of the children, doesn't mean that he can't save some of them. Likewise, while we might not be certain that our donations are actually going to help anyone, even if there's a chance to save a single life at a relatively low cost, then we ought to do so. We ought to donate. So the response to this particular objection is yes, it is too demanding because morality is demanding. Maybe our current situation, our current society needs to be changed. Maybe we should take more seriously our moral obligation to help people. So then in that regard, this is not really an objection to Singer's argument. Rather, it's just a recognition that morality is requiring a lot of us, a lot more than we tend to think. And again, it is a very, very radical view, maybe because morality is itself quite radical. But perhaps somebody could say, yes, that is quite radical. It's simply too radical. But what exactly do we mean when we say it's far too radical? Are we saying that it's so radical that we no longer have the ability to donate some of our money? Is it so radical that we're saying I don't actually have the $3 in my bank account? Well, if that's the case, then why did I just spend $3 on a coffee? Right? Buying a coffee for $3 isn't that radical. Well, spending $3 to save a starving child is not supposed to be all that radical either. It should be what's morally required of us. Or maybe when somebody says it's too radical, what it means is that spending $100 is way too much. But again, if I have the ability to spend $100, if that is basically nothing to me at all, maybe I'm a millionaire. Maybe I've got plenty of excess money. Well, spending $100 or $200 wouldn't be radical in any sense at all. And given that I probably will spend $100 on different things that I don't really need throughout a month, well, that just doesn't seem very radical. Indeed, you might think what's actually radical is the fact that we don't spend that excess money of our income to help save starving children, right? You might think that it's actually really very radical that this is not already just expected of people. But maybe that suggests a different sort of objection. Maybe somebody could object by saying this is just psychologically unrealistic. It's just not the sort of thing that we creatures are very likely to do, right? Maybe evolution, in some sense, has programmed into us the fact that we want to hoard our money for ourselves, the fact that we are more willing to spend $100 on things that we want in our lives, maybe a fancy dinner or a new outfit or something than to be altruistic and to help people on the other side of the world. Now, notice that Singer would probably accept that that's the case. He might accept that psychologically speaking, we're not very likely to do this. And maybe there's a lot of evidence or psychological, data or biological data, perhaps, that would suggest that that is sort of the evolutionary story of how we are programmed in some regard. But even if Singer does recognize that much, Singer would probably say that the mere fact that evolution has programmed us that way, psychologically speaking, is not a good reason to think that that's how we ought to act. Indeed, evolution has programmed humans to act in certain ways, but we already recognize those things as being morally wrong. For instance, somebody might claim that evolution has programmed men to be very aggressive and confrontational and violent. And maybe you could say that that was helpful for us in an evolutionary story. But the mere fact that that's the way that we are programmed, biologically speaking, does not necessarily mean that that's how we ought to behave, right? In fact, you might think that we should act against what our instincts are or what our nature is, right? So if men are naturally more aggressive and more violent, then you might think that we have some sort of moral requirement to act otherwise, right? To act in a non-violent way, in a non-aggressive way, to do the opposite of what evolution has programmed us to be like or what our nature is like. So this objection looks like we can avoid it as well. Now, there's a term here that I want to introduce. The term is supererogatory. And what this term refers to is an action that goes beyond what's required. An example I like to use when I'm teaching this is that, we've got this social norm that when you go out to dinner, it's expected that you're going to tip at least 20%, right? That's what the expectation is. But you could always tip more than that. You could tip 30% or 40%. And so if you decide to tip 30% instead of 20, then that would be a supererogatory action. You're doing more than what's expected or more than what's required. And so a lot of people might object by saying it would be a good thing for you to donate some of your money to help starving children, but that's a kind of charity. That's kind of doing more than what's expected or more than what's required. And so that's a way of saying those actions are supererogatory actions. So then here's the objection. If Singer's view is correct, then it looks like this term, supererogatory actions, or just charity in general, would be sort of incoherent. Why would supererogatory action be incoherent? Because you're not doing more than what's expected. In fact, you're doing exactly what's obligated of you. You're doing what's morally required of you, not more than what's required. Right? So this whole notion of supererogatory actions or charitable actions, it looks like those sorts of actions wouldn't make any sense at all. And given the fact that these sorts of actions do make sense, we have a good understanding of what they are, then that suggests that there might be something wrong with Singer's argument. Now, the fifth objection that I want to consider is known as Hardin's lifeboat ethics or lifeboat objection. This is an objection that Placius discusses in the chapter, and I think that it has a lot of intuitive pull here. So, what is this objection? Well, Garrett Hardin, who's the philosopher that came up with this idea of lifeboat ethics, Hardin uses the following analogy of a lifeboat to make sense of what's going on here. So here's what Hardin says. Quote, approximately two-thirds of the world is desperately poor, and only one-third is comparatively rich. So, metaphorically speaking, each rich nation amounts to a lifeboat full of comparatively rich people. The poor of the world are in other, much more crowded lifeboats, hoping to be admitted to a rich lifeboat or in some other way to benefit from the goodies on board. What should the passengers on the rich lifeboat do? This is the central problem of the ethics of a lifeboat. Now, what Placius points out is that Hardin thinks that it would be a kind of suicide for the lifeboat passengers to just simply start allowing as many people as they want into their own lifeboat, because a lifeboat can only carry so many people. And that seems to suggest that we simply cannot save everyone, and we probably should be careful about admitting anybody into the lifeboat. Because the idea is if you admit too many people into the lifeboat, then everybody's going to drown. Everybody's going to suffer as a result. And so this is the point where we don't want to donate so much money to where everybody now is living in poverty and everybody now is suffering from famine or what have you. And I think a lot of people do take this sort of lifeboat objection very serious. Certainly, that's the kind of thing that I've oftentimes heard when I'm speaking to students about Singer's argument. Now, there's one more objection that I want to consider. I think this is a very interesting objection. I'm calling it Timmerman's drowning children objection. Right here, we're talking about children plural rather than a single child in a shallow pond. And this particular objection comes from Travis Timmerman's article, which you should have read for this week. The article is titled, Sometimes There is Nothing Wrong with Letting a Child Drown. So let's go ahead and take a look at the version of Singer's argument that Timmerman is considering. So it's ordered slightly different, but it's basically the same exact argument. All right, so the first premise says suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care, these are bad things. Again, I think that's intuitively obvious. Most people simply accept that premise. The second premise says, if it is in your power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything nearly as important, then it is wrong for you not to do so. Right? Again, that's the kind of can implies ought principle that's working behind the scenes or under the surface in this argument. Third premise says by donating to aid agencies, you can prevent suffering and death from the lack of food, shelter, and medical care without sacrificing anything nearly as important. Therefore, if you do not donate to aid agencies, you are doing something morally wrong. All right, so it's a slightly different formulation of the argument, but the basic idea is exactly the same. What Timmerman does is accept the first premise, and to some extent, he's going to accept the third premise as well. But instead, he's going to offer a counterexample to the second premise, right? He's going to offer a modified version of the drowning child case. And the reason why he thinks that we need to do this is because the way in which Singer supports that premise, the can implies ought premise, using the shallow pond sort of case, is, according to Timmerman, underspecified. It doesn't give us enough information. And so Timmer's strategy here is going to try to fill in the details, give us more information in order to make sure that the thought experiment actually matches what's going on in the world. And by doing so, he thinks that it's going to create a counterexample to the second premise. So let's consider what exactly Timmerman says with regard to the drowning children, plural sort of case. Here's what Timmerman says. One day, unluckily, Lisa gets a call from her 24-hour bank telling her that hackers have accessed her account and are taking $200 of it every 5 minutes until Lisa shows up in person to put a hold on her account. Now, due to some legal loophole, the bank is not going to be required to reimburse Lisa for any of the money that she may lose, nor will they. In fact, if her account is overdrawn, the bank will seize as much of her assets needed to pay the debt created by the hackers. Fortunately for Lisa, the bank is just across the street from her work and she can get there in fewer than 5 minutes. She was even about to go for a walk past the bank as a part of her daily routine. On her way, Lisa notices a vast space of land covered with hundreds of newly formed shallow ponds, and each of which contain a small child who will drown unless someone will pulls them to safety. So notice the difference here. Instead of a single pond with a single child drowning in it, she sees hundreds of ponds with hundreds of drowning children. Now, Lisa knows that for each child she rescues, an extra child will live who would otherwise have died. Now, it would take Lisa approximately 5 minutes to pull each child to safety, and in what can only be the most horrifically surreal day of her life, Lisa has to decide how many children to rescue before entering the bank. Once she enters the bank, all the children who have not yet been rescued will, in fact, drown. But things get only worse for Lisa. For the remainder of her life, the hackers will repeat their actions on a daily basis. And every day, the pond adjacent to Lisa's bank are filled with drowning children, plural. So one of the reasons why I think that this is a really interesting thought experiment, in addition to the fact that it's supposed to do a better job of matching what's actually going on in the world, because there's hundreds of different children that are starving every single day, and that's going to continue for the rest of your lives. But in addition to that, it looks like this person, Lisa, the character in the thought experiment, at some point, even if she does decide to save some children, at some point she's going to have to draw the line in order to make sure that she goes to the bank and make sure that she doesn't lose all of her money. So where do we draw the line there? We can save maybe a few children, but we can't save all of the children. Right? So that seems like a good kind of counterexample. We have to save some of the children, but we can't save all of them because we also want to make sure that we don't lose all of our money. Now, again, Singer's argument is based upon the can implies ought principle, which says that we're only obligated to do such and such if we can do such and such, right? Assuming that we can lose some of our money, but we can't lose all of our money, then we should save some of the children. But there will be some children that we cannot save. And that brings me back to the point that I raised a moment ago regarding what Plakius says on page 153, where she says, does the fact that he can't save all of them give him a reason not to save any? Surely it does not. So, in the case of Lisa, maybe she can afford to lose some of the money from her bank, but not all of her money. And that seems to suggest, according to Singer's argument, that maybe she should save some of the children, but not all of the children. But what exactly do you think? Do you think Timmerman offers a good objection here, a kind of counterexample to Singer's argument, specifically this premise that says if you can help, then you ought to help? Or do you think that there might be a way for Singer to respond to this sort of objection? Another way to think about that is simply whether or not Timmerman's objection gives us reason not to help some of the drowning children, right? If you think that that sort of situation means that Lisa should just go straight to the bank in order to save all of her money and not save any children, then what justification do you have for that? Otherwise, it looks like you have an obligation to at least help some of the drowning children. And by analogy, then you would also have a moral obligation to help some people who are dying and starving and living in famine and poverty. So those are the things that I want you to think about for this particular module. And I've also included a video where Singer discusses his own view and his paper in much more detail and goes through some of these objections. So I want you to watch that as well.